Hey everybody, welcome to the New Deal. This is episode 3 of the New Deal series on the student loan crisis. Today we're going to be talking about the economic factors that help to catalyze the student loan crisis. And we're also going to be taking a look at how those factors have impacted borrowers through and since the student loan crisis. But before we get into that, if you like the New Deal here on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button below. I would appreciate it. You can also find the New Deal on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can go to thenewdeal.com and check out the blog. You can also find the podcast episodes and the YouTube videos there. And if you want, head over to Twitch, find the New Deal on Twitch, and soon I'll be streaming games with politics or live streaming episode recordings, so you can check out advanced copies of the episodes essentially over on Twitch. If you're listening today, thank you for listening on the podcast. You can find the New Deal podcast on your podcast provider of choice. Please like the podcast, rate the podcast, give me some feedback on what you think I could improve on or what you think I'm doing well. I would appreciate that. Anything that I present digitally on the screen for the listeners today, I will be describing in the best detail I can to make sure that you are not missing out on any of the content in the episode, even though you don't have the visual in front of you. So I promise to do that. I think I messed up once in the last episode. So let's get into it. This episode is going to set us up for the next few. So we've covered student loan basics and the crisis basics. The last episode, we looked at student loan stigmas. Today, we're looking at the economic factors, and this is episode 3. The whole episode is called The Perfect Storm. This is part 1, economic factors. Part 2 is going to be predatory lending, because predatory lending and economic factors are intrinsically linked when we're talking about this crisis. Episode 4 is going to take a look at the fallout of the student loan crisis, who it affected, how it affected them, how it affected the economy, other things that it affected that maybe we didn't really think about or haven't thought about. In episode 5, we're going to take a look at the student loan forgiveness programs and whether or not we should pursue them. $10,000 in forgiveness, $50,000 in forgiveness is a good idea at all. We're going to kind of explore that topic. And then episode 6, we're going to recap the whole series. We're going to make it nice and neat. And hopefully by that point, I've done a decent enough job in conveying information about the student loan crisis that maybe it's changed your mind or at least provide a new perspective for you, which is the goal of this series. So before we get into the new stuff, we're going to get some administrative stuff out of the way real quick. Just a little bit of recap. $1.7 trillion in student loan debt in America, compared to $1.4 trillion in auto debt, or $9.15 billion in credit debt, or $9.86 trillion in mortgage debt. However, if you think about all the mortgages in America, student loan debt is equivalent to over 20% of that number. Not a small number, just to put things in perspective. The class of 2019, 65% of students took out loans for attending school in 2019. The average debt that they took out or accrued was $30,000. And 14% of their parents took loans for them, and those loans averaged $37,000. So these aren't just students that we're talking about. One thing I haven't addressed in the first 2 episodes very much is private loans. So there's $132 billion in private loans owed in America. 91% of undergrad and 62% of graduate private loans were co-signed, which means that the student did not have enough credit for the bank to trust them, and they needed someone who was credit worthy to sign onto the application, which also means that that person is responsible for the loan as well. We're growing the number of people who are affected by this crisis. Finally, 16% of loans for the class of 2019 were private student loans. And historically, private loans have had interest rates as high as 12.45%, which is essentially a credit card interest rate, which is absurd. We'll get into that with predatory lending. Real quick, some loan terms, definitions, and school terms and definitions. When we're talking about loan repayment, if you are in these statuses, this is what it means. If you're in school, you're in school. You don't have to pay. They basically say, hey, focus on your studies, get us back later. After school, you get a 6-month grace period. You're in a grace period. Basically time for you to move where you're going to move and start your job and save some money so you can start paying your loans back. And then you enter active repayment where you're repaying your loans. And then we've got kind of the negative terms, or the areas where we would delay payment, right? So the first is deferment. Deferment is when your loans can be delayed because maybe you're participating in an activity or a program that exempts you from paying the loan back. For instance, if you join the military, your loans can be deferred. If you go back to school, your loans can be deferred. So that's where deferment might be granted. And the flip side of deferment is forbearance. And that's where your loans can be delayed, but this is because you've encountered a hardship. Either you can't pay the loans, or you've lost your job, or you've suffered an injury, or you're disabled. That's when they'll grant you forbearance. And then finally, the worst word is default. If you default on your loan, that means that you have not been able to pay your loan. And the time periods for the default, change. But I believe, for most public loans, I think if you don't pay in 9 months, you'll go into default. If you go into default, they can do something called wage garnishment, where the loan company essentially just takes money out of your paycheck, or they take your whole tax refund. Not fun. So not good to default on your loans, but just wanted to go through those terms. 3 more terms I wanted to get through just because of when I was researching, I hadn't heard them put this way. We have public nonprofit schools, and these are schools that are funded by the government. These are state schools. In Rhode Island, this would be Rhode Island College and CCRI. Other states, maybe UConn or UMass, those are state schools. Then we have private nonprofit schools, and I just haven't thought about these schools in a nonprofit way, but this is Harvard and Yale and any of the other private schools that we typically talk about. They are classified as private nonprofit. And that distinction is important because we also have for-profit schools. And for-profit schools are expensive. They basically admit a very high amount of people. If you apply, they basically accept you. Tuition and fees are used for more than just bettering education. They're used for profit, and these are schools like Kaplan or University of Phoenix or Capella. You see the advertisements on TV. For-profit schools. Keep those terms in mind as we move forward. So, economic factors. Who's in trouble right now? Who are the people who are in trouble? For students who attended for-profit schools, so we're talking about University of Phoenix, Capella, Kaplan, the default rate within 5 years of them graduating. For people who graduated with an associate's, 41% of those people will default in the first 5 years. For people who got a 4-year degree from a for-profit school, 33% of those with a bachelor's will default on their loan from a for-profit school. That's compared to 27% who go to community college, 14% who go to a public 4-year school, and then 13% who go to a private school. So basically, if you go to a for-profit school, your chances of defaulting are through the roof, and we'll get into it with predatory lending because there's some collusion. The average payment for student loans in general is about $300 per month. I also want to touch on racial inequity for a minute. Black students are, as with many things in America, disproportionately affected by student loans. Black students with 4-year degrees default 21% of the time compared to 4% of white students. Among college grads who began school in 2003 and 2004, 35% were Black compared to 12% white who defaulted. So the numbers came up, but disproportionately affected Black people. I'm going to put an image up right here. So what we're looking at is the average student loan debt by age group, and we've got a chart here. And basically, this is just to show who owes the money. So if you're 24 and under, there are 8.5 million borrowers in that bracket, collectively owing 125 billion. Then we've got 25 to 34. There's 15.2 million borrowers in this category, and they owe about 500 billion. And then you've got 35 to 49. That's 14 million borrowers, about the same as the group below, and they owe 550 billion, so just a little bit more. Then you've got ages 50 to 61. It's about 6 million. They owe 220 billion. And then age 62 and up, there's 1.9 million of them who still have student loans, and they owe 65 billion. One thing I want to point out here is that when we're looking at 24 and younger, 25 to 34, and 35 to 49, we are talking primarily about millennials. Millennials were born 1981 to 1996. They are now ages 22 to 38 years old, and they are the generation that has been most heavily affected by this crisis. And I say that because when we start talking about the fallout, the millennials are going to be a focal point for that topic. We have COVID. We're in a COVID recession. Prior to COVID, and it's important to distinguish because of the relief program. Prior to COVID, $355 billion of the $1.7 trillion in debt was either in deferment, forbearance, or in default, which is 20% of all debt was in a essentially negative or non-repayment state. And that included 10 million borrowers, and there are 44 million total borrowers. So it's important to realize that these are big numbers. It's a large amount of money that is not currently being paid back. COVID came along and the government said, wait a minute, no one has to pay their federal loans anymore. You're all going into forbearance. You can continue to pay. Just give us a call. Say you want to keep paying. However, 88% of those loans are still in forbearance. Only 14% are in repayment. And this is important because when we come out of COVID, those people are going to have to start paying their loans back, and unemployment is way up, and the economy isn't great, and hiring isn't great. So that's another thing to look out for moving forward. One of the first economic factors, the biggest, that had an effect even before you took out your loan was tuition increases at the schools. Since 1975, and I'm going to put this graphic up, and this is from an article in the New York Times Magazine that was extremely informative. Student tuition at private schools is up 300% since 1975, and at public schools is up 400%. And this far outpaces inflation. And you can see on this chart here that actually public schools have gone up a little bit more. And you can see on the chart that even though private schools are worth more, they haven't actually raised their prices as much as public schools. This is largely due to capitalism. Education is not the only product that universities have. The students are a product. When students are looking at schools, they say, well, who graduated from that school? What are they doing now? How much do they make? The students are the product. So that means that the colleges have to attract freshmen who have a high potential for becoming a really good, example, a really good product that the college has produced so that they continue to bring in high quality students. And this is problematic because over the last, since 1975, the governments have really reined back their funding of public schools. Much like when cuts need to be made at a high school and they cut the arts program, when it's time for the government to find money or to save on the budget or to have to pay something, one of the first things that gets cut is post-secondary education. So what that means is these public schools aren't getting enough funding from the government, which means that the tuition costs have to go up to make up for it. And it is a endless cycle of price increases. And then the private schools, they're in competition. They need to continue to provide a high level of competitive education, so their prices continue to rise because the more they spend on each student, the better education they provide, the more likely they are to attract new students. So tuition has skyrocketed. That's a huge factor even prior to anyone taking out a loan. The second is wage stagnation. And we touched a little bit on this in the past episodes, and I brought this up yesterday. In 1968, if you take into account inflation, minimum wage was today's $12.02. So in 1968, the minimum wage they made was equal to $12.02 today. Our minimum wage today is $7.25. So someone in 1968 is actually made 30% more money, had more buying power than anyone on minimum wage today, which means Wages have not come up much. It also means that the dollar doesn't have as much buying power, which means that even though we might be making more money, it's not really worth more money. It's not getting us any more money. And that's problematic because, as we've seen, the tuition prices go up, but if wages aren't coming up, you can't keep up. So college begins to get more and more out of grasp for a lot of Americans, especially middle-class Americans. I'm going to, if you look right here, and I'm just going to throw this up. This is the living wage calculator from MIT. And I've put it down in the links. If you want to go check it out, you can type in your state or your city, and it will tell you how much money you need to make in your state in order to survive there. And it takes into account how many kids or how many people in the household are working, your salaries, based on things like, and then it takes factors into account like healthcare, childcare, food, housing, transportation, taxes, civic engagement, things like that. So I would just go check out that calculator for some perspective when we're talking about minimum wage or minimum livable wage. Here are some combined numbers to consider between tuition and wage increase. And this is from that New York Times Magazine article from 2015 by Adam Davidson. So in 1974, the average family in America earned just over $13,000 per year. A new home could be purchased for an average of $36,000, $36,000, about 3 times your annual salary. An average new car was $4,400. Attending a 4-year private college cost $2,000 a year, which was affordable even for people, middle class, lower middle class. If you really worked for it, you could go to private school. And public universities were $510 a year, a quarter of the public universities. In today's perspective, the average median household income is $62,000 today. But an average home costs $174,000. That's up 66% in relation to salary since 1974. A new car, they're about even actually. So cars, good job, auto industry. We're right on track there. Attending a private 4-year college is up 300% compared to your annual salary. So it's 300 times harder essentially to get into private university. And it's 400% harder to get into public university because public university is $2,500 compared to the $510 from 1975. What this means is that without financial aid, most Americans can't go to school. It is out of reach for most Americans to pay out of pocket. This is why so many people take loans. One other thing that is worth noting that's little known, the government regulates how much money can be taken out and by who for federal student loans. In 1992, Congress eliminated the income limits on who can borrow from the government and also lifted the ceiling on the amount. And then in 2006, they removed the limits on how much grad students could borrow. So they took the cap off. So, hey, you can borrow as much as you need to, which maybe isn't great if those people can't afford to pay back those larger numbers. And then finally, before you took out the loan, well, depends on when you took out the loan, we've got the recessions. We've got the Great Recession in 2008. We had employment at 10%. We've now got the COVID recession, where in 2020, the unemployment went to 13%. It's currently sitting at 6.3%, and 11 million people are unemployed in America right now. And I mentioned yesterday, between December 2007 and May of 2016, the unemployment rate never dropped below 5%. And right now we're sitting at 6.3 for comparison. So we're right back in that 2007 to 2016 time period where stuff was not good. The last thing that you might have known, actually you wouldn't have known this. So you take out your loan, right? You might have known some of those things before. You know that you're in a recession, or maybe you could have known that wages went up or tuition went up, or that inflation hadn't kept up with wages. But now you're saddled with the loan. You can't make the payments. You couldn't get a job, for whatever reason. Something I think a lot of people might not know is that traditionally, student loans cannot be included in bankruptcy. And there are some caveats here, but this means that if you file for bankruptcy because you can't afford other debts, student loans won't be included. And so I'm going to put this up on the screen here. Here's a graphic, and I'm going to read the entire thing for the people listening. Chapter 7 Bankruptcy. Here we go. Chapter 7 Bankruptcy, also known as straight bankruptcy, is what most people probably think of when they're considering filing for bankruptcy. Under this type of bankruptcy, you'll be required to allow a federal court trustee to supervise the sale of any assets that aren't exempt. So cars, work-related tools, basic household furnishings may be exempt, which means that you get to keep those. Money from the sale of the other goods goes toward paying your creditors. The balance of what you owe is then eliminated after the bankruptcy is discharged. And here we go. Chapter 7 bankruptcy can't get you out of certain kind of debts. You'll still have to pay court-ordered alimony, child support, and student loans. Student loans are on the same level as child support and alimony when it comes to bankruptcy. You are stuck with your student loan, historically. Now, I did find some hopeful information. Apparently, the way that the federal bankruptcy student loan, language was written by Congress is extremely vague. And basically, it says that if you can prove undue hardship, prove being the key word here, if you can prove undue hardship, you may be allowed to include student loan debt in bankruptcy. However, this was not traditionally done, and it's completely subjective. So it ultimately comes down to which judge you get to determine whether or not that loan would be included. And for the most part, judges would not include it. But that's slowly been changing as this crisis has been going along. The barriers, however, is that you need to pay for bankruptcy, and it costs extra to prove undue hardship for student loans. So you already can't afford your student loans. Now you're paying for bankruptcy, and then you have to pay to get, to prove undue hardship. That's a barrier, and a lot of people just don't do it. They just stick with the loan because they can't afford the extra money in bankruptcy. And there's some talk about changing the language in Congress so that maybe after 7 years, bankruptcy student loans will be considered like any other debt. If you have your loan for 7 years, it can be discharged through bankruptcy as well. But historically and currently, student loan debt is not easy to include in a bankruptcy. You're stuck with it. Financial education. We don't get a lot of financial education in school. I took my loans out as a 17-year-old. I didn't know much about forbearance and deferment and compound interest and capitalized interest and the time frames, and I didn't have a great grasp on how much I'd be making. All that didn't matter because the world changed from the time I entered college to the time I graduated. But one of the most stunning figures is that 37% of students in 2018 did not fill out their FAFSA. FAFSA is your free application for federal student aid, which means that they applied to go to college and they didn't even fill out the paperwork, the free paperwork to potentially get government student aid. And they're taking out private loans. There's a catch-22 here. A lot of people say, well, maybe people shouldn't go to college. But there are still very clear benefits. College grads average $30,000 more per year in salary than people with a high school diploma. Over the course of a lifetime, people with a college degree, bachelor's, will earn $1 million more in their lifetime than someone with a high school diploma. Someone with an associate's degree will earn $300,000 more in a lifetime than someone with a high school diploma. Those are substantial numbers. But 32% of employers, right now, 32% of employers are increasing their education requirements for new hires. 27% of employers are recruiting people who hold a master's degree into positions that previously only required a bachelor's. They're saying, oh, nope, bachelor's isn't good enough anymore. Now we need a master's. 27%. 37% of companies are now requiring a bachelor's degree for jobs where no degree was needed previously. So before high school diploma, you're good to go. Not anymore. 37% of companies are now requiring bachelor degrees for those positions. I'm going to put up this graphic before I wrap that point up. This is the impact of higher education on the job. This is the this is the reasoning behind why companies are asking for higher education. Companies find that someone with a degree produces 57% higher quality work, that they're 48% more productive, that their communication is 38% better, that their innovation and idea generation is 37% better, that their retention rate is higher, they're more likely to stay with the company, and they generate more revenue. College grads, according to this chart, will generate 21% more revenue than someone who doesn't have a degree or an advanced degree, depending on what echelon we're talking here. So let's think about what we've covered in this episode. Most Americans can't afford to go to school without a loan. Local governments aren't funding post-secondary education, and private schools are competing for students because capitalism, and so prices are going up, and wages have been stagnant since the 70s. And on top of that, education needed for employment is increasing, with some entry-level jobs now requiring a master's. Entry-level. So Americans can't afford college, and college is getting more expensive, and Americans aren't making more money, but society requires you now more than ever to have an advanced education, to have a bachelor's, to have a master's degree. There's a gap opening up, and this is part of the income gap that's talked about so much on the news. The people who can afford it get into these jobs. The people can afford it get the degree, they get the jobs, they get the companies more money, they get the retention, and the people who can't afford it start to lose out. And that gap is going to widen. Keep an eye on that. Employers are beginning to offer student loan assistance as part of their benefits package. That's how widespread this problem is. Companies realize that, hey, if we offer to help pay this person's loans back, they will choose us over another company. And so companies are doing this because so many people have student loans. It's a big problem. So again, just for perspective. So I want to take a second to focus on the people. Who are these people? Who are the people who are strapped with debt, who aren't able to make purchases, who aren't making enough money, who could benefit from something like loan forgiveness? And I talked about millennials earlier, so we'll stay with millennials. The average millennial, and remember, we're talking about ages like 25 to 38 or something like that. The average millennial's net worth is $8,000. $8,000 net worth. Average millennial between 25 and 38. So all Americans 25 to 38, the average net worth is $8,000. That's a 34% decrease from 1996 for the same age group. They average a salary of $35,000 per year. This, like half of the workforce, we're talking. $35,000 is the average salary for this age group. And millennials have, on average, less than $5,000 in their bank account. Their net worth is averaging $8,000. They have less than $5,000 in their bank account, and they average $35,000 a year, which is just over a poverty wage, just over half the workforce. We need this perspective. We need to understand when we talk about millennials, we're talking about nearly half the workforce. And this is their lives. This is our lives. This is our reality. Net worth $8,000 on average. Think about what that would mean for renting or buying a house. We'll get to it in our episode about the fallout. So I just wanted to end on that point today, because there's a lot more to talk about. And I want to start hitting on some of the human components of this crisis, which we'll do through predatory lending, and we'll do through the fallout episode, the next 2 episodes. So if you liked what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button below. If you're listening on podcast, like the podcast, rate the podcast. Part 2 of this episode, The Perfect Storm, will come out tomorrow, and that's going to be all about predatory lending. Buckle up for that one, because I feel like that's the information most people don't have and most people need to hear. So Like, subscribe, follow the New Deal. Thank you so much for listening and following along in this series. I'll catch you in the next episode. Have a good one.